A while back, we made a video comparing sustainable and regenerative gardening techniques, and one of you asked if we could make a video comparing organic gardening with regenerative. At first, it kind of seemed like a no-brainer to me. It's something that I felt like I could pretty easily speak to. So, started working on the outline for this video, only to realize that I kind of needed to think about it a little bit more and consider really how to convey the differences in a way that at least I felt were somewhat original, at the very least, slightly unique to how I see it. I don't really claim to be an inventor of any particular gardening framework or practice. Mostly I see myself as a person who can make broad observations and test things out and then present ideas in approachable and applicable ways. So in this video, I'm really kind of asking the question, is regenerative gardening actually a thing? And if so, what does that look like? Organic gardening, as the original question asked about, refers to a gardening practice that abstains from everything that is synthetic, and that's the primary lens. Organic in many ways is about what is taken out of the equation. At least that's how it's traditionally defined. Take out the synthetic fertilizers, remove the toxic pesticides, abstain from herbicide usage, and you're more or less gardening organically. Regenerative, on the other hand, as the word suggests, is focused more on what can be added to the equation in order to improve the garden. In organic gardening, we might ask the question, do I need to remove this input, whatever it might be, from my gardening practice? Regenerative gardening might ask something like, does this input work itself out of a job? And to flesh this out a little bit more, in a conventional gardening approach, we typically have a high amount of inputs with an ongoing or an increasing reliance on those inputs. In organic gardening, I would say that the level of input is still high. You need to fertilize your plants somehow, but there's going to be less of a risk of increasing amount of reliance on those inputs. Regenerative, however, offers an enticing reality that while the initial required inputs might be high, not only will you hopefully never have to increase your reliance, but as I said before, the inputs themselves in some cases might be working themselves out of the job. In other words, a regenerative gardening practice leads to a garden that requires less and less input over time. Hey, if you enjoy learning about these kinds of gardening techniques but are unsure how to put it all together for your garden, you might be a great fit for my Natural Garden Reboot program. I believe that food is medicine, but what are we supposed to do when so much of the food that we buy is covered in chemicals that makes us sick? If you want more say over exactly what goes into your body, I created this framework specifically to help gardeners grow the way that nature intended. If you want to learn more, you can hit the link or scan the code on the screen, and you can find a time to meet with me. I'll make sure to help you figure out the next best steps for your garden, identify where things might be going wrong, and if you would be a good fit for the Natural Garden Reboot. Now back to the video. Now you're probably asking the question, what is an input? And I would define an input as anything that you are putting into or using in your garden, whether it's a material, a supplement, water, a tarp, physical energy, time, whatever. Now, before we get into how you might determine if an input works itself out of a job, there's an important personal factor that I think needs to be in place before we pursue regenerative gardening. Regenerative gardening requires vision. If you're going to improve a growing space to the point where you work yourself out of a job, or at least most of your jobs, you have to be able to see potential, to see what is not there yet. You have to be able to look at a growing space that you are starting out with and say, I believe that this can change. I believe this soil is not a fixed thing. I believe that I can bring native pollinators in my garden. I believe that I can furnish the environment with robust biology. And because it's hard to have vision for something that you don't know really what you're shooting for, let's take a look at the most obvious benchmark, the natural world. We might ask, is nature regenerative? Not really. It's sustainable or sustained. It doesn't really need to improve itself, except in cases where humans have intervened or involved themselves in unhelpful ways. But why is that? How does that happen? How does nature actually sustain itself? I'm going to focus on the things that I think are most relevant to gardening, since there's no way, obviously, that I can speak to the whole way that nature does this. What's most relevant to our discussion here, at least how I see it, is that the way the resources are managed. And sometimes it helps to use an analogy. Analogies by design are not perfect, so don't take this super literally. But let's think about a resource that everyone has to manage at some point, money. We have just started to give our oldest boy, who is 5, opportunities to earn money, usually in $1 increments. And from a management perspective, at present, he is absolutely terrible with his money. Complete inefficiency, to the point where he barely recognizes that a dollar bill as a resource to be managed. It's something that, were he to just hold on to, would probably end up getting eaten by his younger brother, who's 1. Our 5-year-old might take his dollar bill and at best stuff it in his pocket. Maybe he would have the foresight to push it into his toy wallet, but more likely than not, he would put it down somewhere and forget about it. So we show him how he can save his money in a special box that we keep high up out of his younger brother's reach. Now, our boy also has no inclination to do anything with his money other than buy toys from the store. The money itself is doing no work for him beyond giving him a simple ability to trade. He does some raking in the yard, he gets money, he spends the money on a toy, and the process continues. Now, the way that he uses his toys is also terribly inefficient. He leaves them outside to get rained on. They get stretched and tear. He leaves them within reach of his destructive younger brother, and so on. He's not breaking even the slightest. He's just forced into forever raking pine needles in the yard so that he can waste his money on cheap toys that his brother will chew on. Obviously, he will mature. I'm not really that worried. You might be asking, what does any of this have to do with the way that nature manages resources? Well, unlike our 5-year-old, nature is incredibly efficient. In fact, nothing is wasted in the slightest. A plant will grow, drawing nutrients from the soil through its roots, converting carbon dioxide and sunlight into carbohydrates that are stored in its roots and releasing oxygen into the atmosphere that animals breathe to stay alive. The plant might become food for one of those animals, where eventually it would be pooped out back onto the soil. The nutrients that it had used to build its body would at least be partially re-imparted so that nothing is lost. The rest of the plant would be used to help the animal build or sustain its body. If that plant didn't become food for an animal, it might grow through the spring, summer, and fall only to die in the winter, leaving its plant body in place to decay and again re-impart its nutrients back into the soil, but not without having formed flower buds and seeds which to replicate itself, and at least in part, self-fertilize so that it can grow again next season. If that plant wasn't an annual, it might enter a state of dormancy where its energy needs are drastically reduced, drop its solar panels, its leaves, to the ground where they can decompose over the course of the winter and the following season in order to re-impart nutrients again back into the soil. The wild animal that eats the plants and returns them and their nutrients to the soil through its feces will also eventually one day return the collection of materials used to build its entire body by dying and becoming food for other mammals, birds, or insects and bugs who will disperse the nutrients and re-impart them back into, you guessed it, the soil. And so you might be sensing a theme there. Everything seems to return to the soil eventually. It's like the material processing center or the engine of the natural world. But how do dead plants become nutrients again? How do dead animals become soil? The one piece of this ultra-complex system that I haven't referred to yet are the microorganisms. And microbes are what I consider the sort of nutrient cycling oil that lubricates the engine. Again, don't take the analogy too seriously. Here's the thing with nature though. Every living creature in a fully undisturbed environment is born into a world that has provided them with a fully stocked pantry from which to draw. Crucially, all the animals, both plants and animals, do their part to restock the pantry for other inhabitants. They all build soil through their waste, which then comes back around to them in forms that they can use eventually to sustain themselves. And waste is really the wrong word here because, as we kind of already covered, nothing is wasted in nature. If we take a step now into our gardens, we'll probably find them somewhere on the spectrum from nature to 5-year-old with a piggy bank. Some of our gardens are going to be remarkably efficient and effective at managing resources. Others, not so much. And it's your job to judge honestly where you find yourself in that resource management position. I'll say that achieving a nature level of efficiency for productive gardens is, to my knowledge, impossible unless you never want to collect a harvest for yourself. The kinds of foods that we grow in our gardens are pretty resource intensive. As far as plants go, some plants can do a lot with a little, but those aren't going to feed you in such a way that makes all of the effort of gardening worth it for most people. Now, if you happen to be gardening strictly with the intention of providing a habitat for native pollinators, then it's possible that you could manage something that comes a lot closer to fully self-sustaining. But even with something like a food forest, the input of management is still going to be forever present. And if you have a problem with that, then you probably don't really enjoy gardening in the first place, and you might want to find a different hobby. All that said, a regenerative garden is a garden that is moving toward a natural state. On our journey from conventional to organic to regenerative, the ultimate and ultimately unachievable goal is nature. We won't ever be able to fully remove inputs, but we can decrease inputs as we move toward the efficiency seen in nature in the way that it manages resources. This means that crop residue, grass clippings, tree limbs that are cut off or fall to the ground, leaves that fall to the ground, all of these things need to be seen as resources for the garden, not waste products. these need to be redeposited into, or more accurately onto, the soil. And as I've been alluding to, they need to be processed into plant-available nutrients by microorganisms. Bacteria, fungi, protozoa, nematodes, and microscopic animals all have unique roles to play in this system of nutrient cycling. The rate, or the speed by which organic matter is converted into bioavailable nutrients for plants, is one metric that we might use to determine soil regeneration. Regenerative gardening is a practice of microbial stewardship. Now, simply gradually incorporating organic matter into your soil year over year will steward the microorganisms in your soil toward greater efficiency. The function of many of the soil inoculants that we teach you to make on this channel are to give an added surge of biology to further aid in the decomposition of organic matter. IMO4, or indigenous microorganisms, stage 4, is the process of integrating wild microbes found in nature with your field or garden soil. And this technique is a bit of a challenge and might not be for everyone. But one of the reasons that we pursue it in our growing practice is in an attempt to establish long-lasting fungal cultures in our soil, cultures that will stay alive and become more effective at doing their job in breaking down the organic matter that we give to the soil. So much of our work here to steward the soil is just helping manage resources, helping to convert resources as quickly as possible into nutrients that can be redeposited into the soil. And so, in as many ways as possible, we're trying to examine and re-examine our waste streams so they can be best utilized, and we're intentionally trying to steward those resources back into the soil. Bokashi fermentation is a huge help in this area. It's a technique that we've used almost since the very beginning of our gardening practice, and it's one that has stayed consistent throughout. We really love using this because not only does it help us return what would otherwise be seen as food waste back to the soil where we garden, but since food scraps are often what we would call high nitrogen content materials, we can and do use the Bokashi food scraps in our compost piles to break down carbon-rich materials. And I know that this probably sounds a bit repetitive by now, but making compost, applying it to your soil, and washing biology through it into your soil is genuinely one of the best ways of regeneratively gardening. Now, compost and additional microorganisms are still inputs, and they're inputs that we need to ask the question of, are you working yourself out of a job? And the answer, I believe, is yes. At some level, the amount of compost that we apply to our soil should decrease over the years after a new baseline is established. And at a certain point, I hope to be able to simply leave behind roots in the ground from crops that have been harvested and then toss the crop residue back onto the soil from where it was harvested. Beyond this, we will always have some amount of food waste from our home, at least until the day that our kids stop insisting on throwing half of their meals in the ground. And so that food waste will continue to go back into the soil so that we can continue to grow more again. You can't make endless withdrawals from the soil, but you can work toward replicating that fully stocked pantry with which nature supplies all of its plants. Another thing that we will work toward over the years is gradually phasing out our intensive or heavy feeding annual crops in favor of perennials that take a while to get established, but that can produce for many years without as much input. For our flower farm, we'll invest in perennials that we can harvest flowers and foliage from at various points in the growing season. For our food, we'll continue to invest in our fruit trees and our bushes. Everything is attached to a cycle, and nothing can be taken from endlessly without receiving anything back in return. But these are some of the ways that you can work toward investing in a sort of dividend fund that pays you back each year without needing to add more to the pot beyond your time and your management. Simply working to improve the structure and the composition of your soil will pay you back each year, since crops become easier and easier to grow in better soil. I'm gonna cap things off here because I feel like if I go on much further, we'll be here for hours. Hopefully this didn't stay too vague for those of you who are looking for more practical insights. I actually wanted to keep it simple and straightforward as possible. Perhaps many of you are already doing things like this and just need the encouragement to keep going, keep doing these things. If there's anything more that you wish that I would expand on, please let me know. As always, in the comments. I always give priority to folks in my natural gardening community on School, which is a pretty good deal considering it is free to join. You can use the link in the description or you can scan the code on the screen. If you're new to all of this and you want to dive a little bit deeper into many of the ways that you can improve your soil using homemade soil amendments, you can check out this video next. Thank you as always for watching. I'll see you in the next one.